Of all sciences, whether true or false, which have at any time engaged the attention of the world, there is not one of which the real or assumed principles are less generally known in the present age than those of astrology. The whole doctrine of this science is commonly understood to have completely overturned, and of late, people seem to have satisfied themselves with merely knowing the import of its name. Such contented ignorance in persons, too, sufficiently informed in other respects, is the more extraordinary, since astrology has sustained a most conspicuous part throughout the history of the world, even until days comparatively recent. In the East, where it first arose at a period of very remote antiquity, and whence it came to subjugate the intellect of Europe, it still even now holds sway. In Europe and in every part of the world where learning had impressed the human soil, astrology reigned supreme until the middle of the 17th century. It entered into the council of princes, it guided the policy of nations, and ruled the daily actions of individuals. All this is attested by the records of every nation which has a history, and by none more fully than those of England. Yet, with these striking facts before their eyes, the present generation seem never until now to have inquired on what basis this belief or their forefathers was established, nor by what authority the delusion, if it was one, could have been for so many ages supported. Among 1,000 persons who now treat the mention of astrology with superfluous ridicule, there is scarcely one who knows distinctly what it is he laughs at, or on what plea his ancestors should stand excused for having, in their day, contemplated with respect the unfortunate object of modern derision. The general want of information on these points, and the indifference with which such want has been hitherto regarded, cannot surely be attributed solely to the modern disrepute of the science, for mankind have usually, in every successive age, exercised great industry in tracing all previous customs, however trifling or obsolete, and in examining all sorts of creeds, however unimportant or erroneous. Whenever there has appeared any striking connection between such manners and historical facts, and since astrology is most unquestionably blended intimately with history, it therefore becomes necessary to seek for some further hypothesis by which this ignorance and indifference may be accounted for. Perhaps astrology has been conceived to have borne the same relation to astronomy as alchemy did to chemistry. If such has been the notion, it has certainly been adopted in error, for a modern chemist is still almost an alchemist. It is true that he no longer delays his work to deference to the planets, nor does he now try to make gold, nor to distill elixir of earthly immortality. But nevertheless, he still avails himself to a certain degree of the same rules and the same means as those of the old alchemists. He is still intent upon the subtle processes of nature, and still imitates her as far as he can. He reduces the diamond to charcoal by an operation analogous to that by which the alchemist sought to transmute lead into gold, and he mainly differs from the alchemist only in having assured himself that there is a point beyond which nature forbids facilames. Not so slightly, however, does the astronomer differ than the astrologer, but toto quello. The astrologer considered the heavenly bodies and their motions merely as the mechanism wherewith he was to weave the tissue of his predictions, and astronomy is no more an integral part of astrology than the loom is of the web which has been woven by it. To have an idea of what alchemy was, it is sufficient to have an idea of chemistry, but astronomy in itself will never give a notion of astrology which requires additional and distinct consideration. It may be urged that in the present day, a general idea of this bygone and disused science is quite sufficient for everybody not professedly antiquarian. Such an assertion would doubtless never be controverted, provided the proposed general idea might comprehend the truth. But the present actual general idea of astrology is by no means so comprehensive indeed. Nothing can well be more inaccurate or even more false. It seems to have been adopted not from the elements of the science itself, but from trite observations made by writers against the science, and consequently, the world now wonders at the lamentable defect of understanding that could have permitted belief in it, forgetting that astrology has been consigned to neglect, not to consequence of any prima facie palpability in its impued fallacies, nor indeed of any special skill or acuteness on the part of its professed adversaries, but rather in consequence of the sudden and astonishing growth of other undoubted studies with which it has been presumed to be incompatible, and which, during the thousands of years of the reign of astrology, were either unborn or still slumbering in continued infancy. The words professed adversaries, which have just now been used, are of course not intended to be applied to those mighty explorers of nature's laws and man's powers who, in their lofty career, may have made an incidental swoop at the pretensions of astrology. Directly engaged in more exact pursuits, they stop not to dissect this their casual prey, which, after having been thus struck by eagles, was left to regale crows and daws, and these, in their convivial loquacity, accuse their unfortunate victims of crimes incapable of being committed, and of offenses which had never been imagined. Of the real faults of their victim, these garrulous bipeds seem not to have been aware, or if aware, they seem to have considered them not sufficiently prominent, nor was this the want of candor or information absolutely confined to the mere vulgar herd of vituperative scribblers. For even in the sparkling essay against astrology written by Voltaire, in his irrepressible desire to convince the world that he was au fait in everything, proves only that the writer, though the most generally informed man of his time, had mistaken the really admissible points of the object of his attack. The author of the present translation has no intention now of either advocating or impugning the doctrines of the science of which his translation discourses. His purpose is a different one. He has that sort of respect for the dead which are really dead, which, although it does not incline him to praise them more than the living, which are yet alive, it is sufficient to incite him to endeavor to avert the imputation to idiot credulity to which their faith in astrology seems now to subject them in the general opinion of the enlightened individual, enlightened living. And while he disclaims all idea of presuming to offer any argument on either side of the question as to the validity of the science, he must still at the same time confess his admiration of the ingenuity and contrivance manifest in its construction, and avow his readiness to believe that in all its harmonized complications might have easily held dominion over some of the strongest minds in that darker period when it flourished. In executing here the desire of attempting to vindicate ancient credence in astrology, an elaborate disquisition would surely not only be unnecessary but displaced. It seems sufficient to refer the reader to the work of which the following is a translation, and to these undisputed facts, that the science was formerly inculcated at the highest and most erudite authorities of the period, that it was insisted on by Voltaires in all parts of the world, arresting and producing instances of its truth, and moreover, that it was so finely and beautifully put together as to cause only deficiency of one small, though most important, link in its whole chain of argument, to be undetected by dull minds and readily supported by enthusiastic genius. For centuries after centuries, all branches of learning were either made subservient to astrology or carried on in close alliance with it. And many of the illustrious names with which it recalls to our collection are gratefully reverenced even by modern science. The genius of Roger Bacon, although he was the first of that school of natural philosophy which acknowledges none but experimental truths, was nevertheless bowed to the doctrines of judicial astrology, and his greater namesake, who after an interval of several centuries succeeded to him in giving proper direction to the mental energy, was still an arguer in favor of celestial influences. It may be, therefore, fairly inferred that the subtle spell which had strength to enthrall stuff so stern could have been of no weak or vulgar order, but that it was sufficiently potent and refined to interest and amuse even the present age. In this little volume will be found the whole of the elements of astrology, and the entire groundwork of those stupendous tomes in folio and quarto on the same subject, which were produced in myriads during the 16th and 17th centuries for the due mystification of the then world. The present volume is addressed equally to the general reader as well to the votary of pure astrology. If any such there be, to the one it offers amusement, for the other it should contain the most glowing interest. Even to the speculative metaphysician, it will furnish food for contemplation, for addition to its peculiar hypothesis of cause and effect. It develops many of those apparent incongruities of character so often united in the same individual. And this development, even although adapted to the doctrines of the stars, still merits attention, inasmuch as the phenomena of which it treats, in whatever way they may be produced or regulated, will ever remain in actual existence. The only English translation of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos hitherto published appears to have been first set forth in 1701 under the name of the Quadripartite. That publication has been long removed from general sale, and its gross misinterpretation of the author, caused by the carelessness or ignorance of Whaley and his assistants by whom it was produced, has rendered most of its pages unintelligible, its absence therefore scarcely to be regretted. The second edition of the same translation, professing to be revised, corrected, and improved, and published by Brown and Sibley in 1786, was not in any one instance purified from the blunders and obscurities which disgraced its predecessor. It seems in fact less excusable than the former edition, of which it was merely a reprint, without being at all corrected, not even in certain typographical errata which the former printer had been zealous enough to point out in his final page. Even this second publication, worthless as it extrinsically is, can rarely now be met with, and like the former, only at a very heavy price. The present translation has been made from Proclus's Greek paraphrase of Ptolemy's original text. The edition followed is that of Elzevir's, dated in 1635. But in the course of translation, continual references have been also had to various editions of the original text in order to ascertain the proper acceptation of doubtful passages. The editions thus inspected were that by Camerarius, printed at Nuremberg in 1535, then by Melanchthon, printed at Basel in 1553, and that by Jonctinus, printed with his own enormous commentaries at Lyon in 1581. Independently of these references, the present translation has been collated with the Latin of Leo Alatius and with two other Latin translations, one printed at Basel, together with a translation of the Almagest in 1541, the other itself at Perugio in 1646. The translator has devoted all this extreme care and attention to his labors in the wish to render Ptolemy's astro-judicial doctrine into English as purely and perfectly as possible. And with the same view, he has likewise added in an appendix certain extracts from such parts of the Almagest as were found to be referenced in his present work. Further illustration is also given by notes gathered in Primum Mobile of Placidus, and from a variety of other sources whence any elucidation of the text might be derived. Even Whaley's annotations, to use his own grandiloquent designation, have occasionally yielded information, not altogether unimportant, although generally incomplete. It seems improper to close this preface, notwithstanding the bulk it has already attained, without annexing the following short notice of the life and works of the great man from whom the Tetrabiblos has emanated. Claudius Ptolemy was born at Pelusium in Egypt and became an illustrious disciple of the school of Alexandria, in which city he flourished during the reign of Adrian and that of Antonius Pius. The date of his birth has been commonly assigned to the 70th year of the Christian era, but the accuracy of this date seems questionable, for he has himself noted in one part of his works that Antonius reigned 23 years. He must have therefore survived this prince, and it is not probable that he continued his scientific labors until after 90 years of age, which he must have done had he been born about the year 70, because Antonius died in the year 161. It seems that his birth would be more properly ascribed to some later period. Moreover, it is asserted by the Arabians that he died in the 78th year of his age, and a similar statement is also made by Luca Gauricus in the dedication of his versions of the Alchemist to Domenico Pallavicini. Gauricus has, however, placed his death in the year 147, which does not accord with the fact of his having survived Antoninius.